It's my pleasure to introduce Mick Stephenson from Ambulance Victoria. Actually, we probably had more of an interesting chat rather than read your CV. We've just had a chat about 20 years ago when you started an ambulance, whether you thought you'd be an adjunct professor. And Mick was just saying that this is an interesting event, but the research that paramedicine is doing now is phenomenal across the countries, across Australasia, and Mick is instrumental in that with a number of significant research outcomes over the year. But today we're going to hear about Thunderstorm Asthma, and we sit over there in New Zealand and we worry about a few things that occur there, but when we look back for these events we think, my God, you know, tough days when these sorts of events occur across the ditch. So we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks very much, Brendan. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for staying back late enough to hear me talk. So I appreciate it. You might be sad that you did at the end, but nonetheless, thank you. I just want to have a bit of a plug first. I'm not overly keen on coming to conferences and telling stories about single events. You know, this isn't a story about the great unwashed. It's not a story of sepsis or heart failure and all those things that we spend all our time doing that kill thousands of people a year. This is an event that killed 9 people in Victoria tragically. 8 of those were patients of ours. And it's a single event. We'd probably had 1 death previously in Victoria we know of many years ago from Thunderstorm Asthma, but it's created more noise in Victoria than anything else that I've seen in a very long time. You know, it's been on 60 Minutes, it was on every news article for probably a couple of weeks on end. It's created enormous interest from the state. There was a symposium put together soon after it occurred. I think 1,000 people turned up for 2 days straight. I'm yet to be called to the symposium to try and save people's lives from sepsis, which is clearly a much bigger problem than this. But nonetheless, it was an event that got people's attention. There is still an outstanding coroner's report that's been formulated by the Inspector General for Emergency Management, so we don't have the results of those deaths yet, although we know a little about it. Interesting enough, and it's not in the presentation per se because it's not been subject of a finding in a review yet, but it will be in the coroner's report. The biggest complaint we have had out of this, or the most noise that's arisen because of Thunderstorm Asthma, is the fact that we didn't tell people we weren't coming. And I've had the misfortune of sitting in a couple of people's homes who've lost loved ones as a consequence of this event. There's a very famous case that became the face of Thunderstorm Asthma, Hope Marsh, 21-year-old girl who died out at Roxburgh Park. And I sat with her mum, and mum would be barely 40, I think. She's got 3 children. Hope was the oldest of them. And her only complaint really with us was that we never told her we weren't coming, and we did tell her we were when we weren't. And we told her 3 times that we were coming, and we weren't. And eventually we rolled up about 30 minutes later, and about half the deaths that occurred, our response times were well in excess of what we would expect, you know, for someone who's critically ill. So anyway, as I say, you know, 9 people tragically died. How do I work this thing, mate? Here we go. Probably that. Righto, so 21st of November last year was the hottest day we'd had since March. There was a severe thunderstorm warning extended by the Bureau, and that warning came out at about 4 o'clock, and they predicted gusts of wind in excess of 100 kilometres an hour through Geelong and across Melbourne. And for those that don't know Victoria very well, Geelong's our second biggest city, sits west and south of Melbourne somewhat. The winds reached Geelong at about 5 p.m. and it moved rapidly eastwards across the metropolitan area. It took about an hour to get into Melbourne. It was well and truly in Melbourne within an hour. And Esther, our call-taking system in Victoria, started receiving multiple 000 calls. The cause of those multiple 000 calls was unknown at that time, and very soon after we started to get calls to say there's a lot of respiratory cases. That's what the storm looked like. So it was like a razor blade, you know, cutting across the west of Victoria. Geelong down on the bottom right-hand side for you guys, and Melbourne obviously across the top of the bay. I'll play this for you, and you get a bit of a picture of what the storm looked like. No, I won't. Now I'm buggered. How do I go back, mate? That one? Now, got to get this. Here we go. Just get a bit of a picture of what the winds look like. So this is 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It's normally broad daylight. We went for a day down to St Kilda. She was a bit rugged. You wouldn't want to be one of the blokes sitting in one of those cranes, I tell you, because if you watch them, they're swaying around pretty heavily. the kids' trampoline. We don't know whether there was a kid on it. Anyway. So what do we know about thunderstorm asthma? Well, interestingly enough, when the language started that night, and I know I was speaking to Tony Walker on the phone as this was going on, he said, is this thunderstorm asthma? And I googled thunderstorm asthma to see if there'd been much written about it previously, and there is a little bit. And we did one previous episode in 2010, I think, that I knew of, but it's been reported in Australia. Melbourne, we've had 4 episodes now. Wagga's had many episodes, but had a big episode in 97. 220 odd patients presented to hospital, 40 odd were admitted. Tamworth occurred in 1990, Canberra in 2010, but it's also occurred multiple times in the UK, Canada, Greece, Italy, Iran and the USA. It's unclear why it doesn't occur with all thunderstorms, but if you think about it in terms of prevalence and the fact that people said we hadn't heard of this before or didn't know about it, in Wagga, every year in springtime, the milk cartons have thunderstorm asthma warnings on them. They produce fridge magnets. There are posters up around the place. And Wagga have got, in their emergency departments, have asthma waiting room protocols for this eventuality because it happens relatively frequently. In 2012, there was a systematic review published that looked at 35 publications. Interestingly enough, 22 of the episodes of thunderstorm asthma that occurred previously around the world had a brother or sister episode, so there were 11 episodes that were repeated the year after. What is known is that in all of the cases there appeared to be ruptured pollen grains, so that a big grain of pollen had been ruptured. It distributes up to about 7,000 particles out of that pollen grain. Those particles are small enough to end up in your alveoli. They're also negatively charged and they attach to the alveoli nicely. So rather than be trapped in your nares as a full pollen grain and cause allergic rhinitis, they end up in your lungs and cause allergic asthma. Of course, in Australia, we have very high pollen counts through spring, and as I said, those charged pollen particles lodge in your lungs very nicely, as it turns out. So in terms of what we know about in Melbourne, we had an episode you'll notice all of these are in November, so hold on, we're only a couple of months away. In 1987, there was 1 death. In 1989, no deaths. Both of those instances saw a 5 to 10-fold increase in the number of asthma presentations to EDs in Melbourne at that time. On the 25th of November, we had our previous biggest episode, and there were no deaths associated with that. And it's in fact noted retrospectively. It was reported a couple of days later once the EDs had their patient surveillance to say, gee, we had a lot of asthmatics, we had more presentations than normal. It wasn't noticed particularly at the time. And then last year, as I said, on the 21st of November, 9 deaths. What is known of those patients previously, and in this particular instance, almost all of the patients had no history of asthma. They almost all had a history of allergic rhinitis. What's been noted in the past when these people have been sensitivity tested post the event, that the patients tend to be sensitive to rye pollen but not to other allergens. And so the rye pollen allergy is unique to this group. It's never been described as an emergency management type event in Victoria, so there's never been any planning done around this happening at large scale. So what happens? Essentially, as the storm forms, whole pollen grains are swept up into the cloud. This is what's thought to happen. And then as the storm matures, it collects more and more pollen. The pollen grains are broken down in the cloud by the moisture in the cloud, and then as the storm as you release the rain and wind and so on, the dry, cold outflows carry pollen back down to the ground, or pollen, fragmented pollen, and obviously people can inhale it. That comes from Deakin University's pollen surveillance system that they've got running, and both Deakin and Melbourne Uni have been keeping a track of this phenomena now for 10 years. And every day these geeks go out and they check the sticky tape, to see if there's any pollen on it. This day they got really excited. Unfortunately, it wasn't so exciting for a lot of patients. But you'll notice the single arrow up to the top of my left is an unfractured pollen grain. And those with the double arrows are those pollen grains that have been broken down. And you'll notice they've got no contents on the inside of them. All of those contents have been sprayed around the place. They're set up to 7,000 particles out of each grain. Those small grains will lodge in alveoli. So that's what it looks like. And there's one of these at Geelong, there's another one in Burwood, and Melbourne Uni have got one at Melbourne Uni in the city. But as I said, for 10 years they've been sitting around watching this phenomena, and this was the one day they decided we were going to have thunderstorm asthma. So they recognised that they could see it through their surveillance. We didn't have any mechanism in the state to report it. or to warn anyone. So why were we particularly set up for thunderstorm asthma on this occasion? Well, in 2016, if you look over to the west of the state, where you see the dark blue, that is the highest ever rainfall we've had in the history of Victoria. So ever since rainfall figures have been kept, we had our wettest year in the west of the state ever. So the farmers would have been whinging about the rain instead of the dry. And if you look at the curing of the grass out in the west of the state, up to the top of my right is 2014, and then 2015. You can see in November, and the 24th of November, I think those are reported, the grass is largely cured. The pollen is gone. So it's been blown out of the grass, or whatever it's done, whatever it normally does. And you'll notice on the 21st of November last year, the grass was not cured. It was alive and well, and it was heavily laden with pollen. So what happened to us? So at about 6 o'clock at night, there was a few cases came in at Geelong, overwhelmed Geelong ever so briefly, and then it just reverted back to normal. The storm was gone, and they had a slight increase in presentation in their emergency department, but it was manageable. And then at about 6 o'clock, we started to notice the impact of it in Melbourne, and really about 18:30 was really the heavy load. So between 6 at night and 6 in the morning the following day on the 22nd, we took about 2,300 emergency calls. In the 12 hours, that same 12 hours, we did about 2,700 emergency and non-emergency cases. Nearly 1,000 of those were coded as breathing problems, so way disproportionately represented compared to normal. Between 6 and midnight, 1,326 cases, which is about 2.5 times our normal load. And the peak period was between 1900 and 1915, where we took 201 000 calls, so 1 every 4.5 seconds compared to 1 every 50 seconds that we normally take. 332 patients were assessed that night by paramedics as having acute or severe respiratory distress. And you often hear trite comments about AMBO saving lives every day, and for many of us, of course, you go for days and months without actually doing that. It's the first time I've ever really thought that there were people genuinely running around saving life after life. And you've never seen so much adrenaline given out. And patients multiply loaded, so we only have single load ambulances in Victoria, and there were patients being lined up on stretchers and being darted with adrenaline in the arm on the way to hospital and had their lives saved. So genuinely life-saving intervention on that night. At about 8 o'clock that night, so about an hour and a half after we got the heavy load, we had 150 Signal 1 or lights and sirens cases pending that we could not dispatch. It was a record for us. So we had cases sitting in the box, needed lights and sirens ambulance that we didn't have an ambulance to dispatch. Some of those died. Between the workload settled down predominantly by about 9 o'clock or 9:30, but between 9 and midnight we ran at about 2.5 times normal load, or 150% above normal. The EDs by about 7 o'clock were talking us to say that they was receiving unprecedented amounts of patients, both from us and walk-in, and they ran for a day and a half at about 50% above normal levels. That's what it looked like in terms of our workload. If you look the day before, you see the early hours of the morning, we bottom out. About 7 o'clock as people start to wake, it spikes up and stays pretty constant through the day. And then at 6 o'clock you saw what happened, with just 200 calls in 15 minutes. And that was sustained through to about 9:30, a really heavy load, and then plateaued out again, although we had presentations above normal for about 30 hours afterwards. That's the pending box in metropolitan Melbourne. So the red are Signal 1 cases that can't be dispatched for 5 minutes or more. The dark blue are the Signal 2, so we hope to get to in less than 30 minutes, that are not able to be dispatched. And the light blue, the Signal 3s, those we hope to get to within an hour that can't be dispatched. So we've never seen that phenomenon before. We hope to never see it again. You can see there's a hell of a lot of patients sitting there in a Signal 1 box that haven't received an ambulance. Compared to our previous big surge events, this is what Thunderstorm Asthma looked like, which is over on my left. The heat wave in 29th of January and the 30th of January 2009. Still today Australia's biggest health disaster. I think 470 odd people above normal died over those 2 days. Our cardiac arrest rate was 11 or 12 times its normal rate. And as I said today, still the biggest killer of humans in Australia ever over that period of time. But you can see the load was still nowhere near like it was on Thunderstorm Asthma night. Black Saturday, of course, a very famous day, 179 Victorians died. But our workload over that 12-hour period was a little bit more than normal. Interestingly, on that day, all the normal stuff dropped off and the burn stuff started. Drawn AFL Grand Final, that's what happens when a whole lot of lunatic Collingwood supporters get out of hand. One of them's down there, good mate of mine. And you were probably out doing it, weren't you? Yeah. Did you call an ambulance, Shane? Probably. Yeah. They won the next week. I think it was worse. That's Thunderstorm Asthma in 2010. As I said, it was barely noticed by us at the time. And as I said, no one died. And then Thunderstorm Asthma for the 12 hours. You can see the load there compared to other previous disasters. And I can tell you, I remember the heat wave days very well, and you could not imagine that we could be that stretched until the night of Thunderstorm Asthma. I'll play this for you. This is a picture of the respiratory cases. So each little red dot's are respiratory cases that arises, and so it starts the day before. I'll speed it up a little bit if I can. So each of these is a 000 call for respiratory case. This is the sort of 24 hours prior. I'm trying to make this thing go quicker. I can't. You just have to watch it. So we're sneaking up. This is the early hours of the morning on the 21st of November. We're just sneaking up midday. So just the odd dribs and drabs. And then at 5 o'clock you'll start to see Geelong down in the bottom right hand side, on my right hand side, start to have a few. And here we go. And you're now sneaking down into sort of, this is about 9:30 at night, and it starts to slow down a little bit. But you can see the even it's still 2 o'clock in the morning, still got quite significant load. I'll skip forward. And if you look at where the patients came from, interesting. So this is by postcode, and then through the slide you'll see by postcode, by time, and there's a little clock running up in the right hand side for the latter half of this. So, whoops. Jeez. No good leaving me with this stuff, Brendan, I'll tell you. There you go. So Geelong down in the bottom right-hand side, and then Greater Melbourne. And you'll notice as this tips up that the west was disproportionately represented. So over on the right-hand side, the west of Melbourne. And about 40% of our total caseload is derived in the west of Melbourne anyway. It's the busiest area for ambulance in Victoria. And as it spun around, got across the bay, and there's another little peak around the southeastern suburbs like Dandenong and so on the outside of Melbourne. And it'll spin around, the little clock will start running, and you'll start to see the cases come in by time in those postcodes. This is the early hours of the morning the day before, so we're up to 6 in the morning, any minute now. So it's midday on the 21st. This is calls to ambulance, and that's what happened when Thunderstorm Asthma came. And still went pretty hard through the early hours of the morning, so considerably more the following day than we would normally experience. So we had much heavier load, as I said, for about 30 hours. So what happened in terms of hospital presentations? The hospitals knew as soon as we did, because people walking past hospitals started walking in. So they saw a sudden increase in respiratory presentations, and there they are there. They remained elevated well above normal levels. You can see it's the red line for more than 30 hours. They also, when we look through you do the discharge surveillance on these patients, there's a whole lot of nil diagnosis patients. They were thought to be asthmatics that were treated and discharged, and no one bothered to record a diagnosis. So in terms of the increased load, across both Melbourne and Geelong, there was a 62% increase, so 9,100 presentations in 30 hours, which is about 3,500 above what we'd normally expect, so a 62% increase above the 3-year average, which is about 5,500. And there are about 3,500 respiratory no diagnosis presentations to Metro and Barwon, which is a 660% increase on normal respiratory presentations over that time. The blue lines are ambulance transports to the Melbourne and Geelong EDs, and the red lines are the walk-ins. So you can see normally there's a slightly greater number of walk-ins than there is ambulance presentations. That remained the same, but disproportionately so. So people just pouring in off the street, and the EDs were overwhelmed very quickly. In terms of our overall caseload, the overall load was about 32% higher than it was the week prior on the same day. In terms of the Signal 1 caseload, and this is where the complexity for us is, these patients were sicker than we would normally see. There was a 72% increase in lights and sirens cases for that same period of time, and as you can see, it remained elevated for the following day as well. And in terms of respiratory cases, a 255% increase on the week before and the same day the week before. So phenomenal load and very heavy load of very sick people. So what do we do? Well, the first reports to us were at about 18:30 in Melbourne, and I know I first got called at 18:37. And what was described to me was that we just didn't have any ambulance left in the west of Melbourne to dispatch, so there was no one available for dispatch. We informally implemented our demand management processes, and I think my instruction at the time was the director in the west of Melbourne was to just upscale everything that we had, so just go to sort of full scale implementation. And he said, "Oh, do you think we need to?" I said, "Well, we can always wind it back. No hope of that." Ambulance demand itself was under control by about 9:30, so we'd got on top of the pending box, so we didn't have Signal 1 cases pending after sort of 9:30. But demand was pretty high through till about 7 o'clock, but we were able to manage after 9. And as I said, that call volume remained high, certainly for the next day and a little bit into the day after. In terms of our performance on that day, normally we've been travelling at about 80% of Code 1 cases or lights and sirens cases within 15 minutes. We did 57% for that night, so there's a lot of patients waited a long time who were very sick. So what do? We recalled a heap of staff in our communications centre and our secondary referral service. The referral service began to manage calls that would normally be managed by the ESTA call takers and took a very significant proportion of the load, and I'll describe that to you in a moment. We recalled a number of emergency crews, and in fact everyone we could at the time. We had additional contracted and non-contracted non-emergency crews, so we converted our non-emergency ambulances into emergency ambulances. We expanded the MFB Emergency Medical Response Program. We have fire co-responders in Melbourne for priority zero events, so cardiac arrest or near cardiac arrest events. So we got our fire colleagues on board, and they agreed to respond to other cases other than cardiac arrest. Victoria Police agreed to respond to cases for us, do welfare calls. We were unable to reach people after they'd called us. Operational managers turned out for first response. We altered our dispatch arrangements so that we could utilise these additional resources, and we went out to the media and let people know what was going on. Nowhere near enough, but we did. So in terms of our activation, our formal emergency response plan wasn't activated, and that's for a number of reasons, but we had previously been instructed that emergency response plan activation wasn't for normal business, and this was deemed to be normal business at the time. In essence, the upscaling that went on would be all that we would do normally under emergency response plan, although a whole lot of stakeholders that we would normally inform as a consequence of that were probably not informed. We managed to form 74 additional ALS crews, both two-person crews. There was about 48, I think, two-person crews, the rest were single responders. 5 additional intensive care crews. The fire brigade responded for us and attended 11 cases. Police attended 17 cases. Interestingly enough, none of those patients were sick, so the fire and police didn't find a sick patient. We upscaled our non-emerge resources by 50% compared to what we'd normally have on at that time, and 5 field emergency medical officers turned out, so 5 doctors began turning out for us. About 20% of the cases that night were dealt with by non-AV resources, by resources that we wouldn't normally be responding with, and the demand, as I said, it decreased by about 9 o'clock, and we started to get on top of it. So in terms of the referral service had about, I think it's got about 15 paramedics and nurses working in at that time of day. We added an additional 6 triage paramedics. They ended up taking 40% of the total 000 calls that night, or during the peak period between 6 and midnight. It normally takes about 25%. Of those calls that they took, 38% of calls were managed without an ambulance attendance, and which meant about 23% of our caseload overall was managed without ambulance attendance. Normally, to have no ambulance, so non-emergency ambulance or an emergency ambulance, normally about 7 or 8% of our workload is managed that way. So it's a very significant increase, and pretty handy when you're in that much trouble. In terms of the crews that are on at time, the dark blue lines are the rostered crews that would be logged into CAT at that time of day. The yellow is the additional crews that were formed. You don't like my talk, Han? What's going on, mate? See you, mate. See you, mate. So the yellow lines are the additional crews that were on at that particular time, so you can see how we were travelling up to sort of midnight there in terms of additional staffing. And if nothing else on that particular night, people were volunteering themselves all over the place to come and work all night. In terms of the state response, Thunderstorm Asthma would rightly be classified as a Class 2 emergency statewide health disaster, which means it's a natural disaster, and the Department of Health and Human Services would be the designated control agency under normal circumstances. At 8 p.m. that night, so an hour and a half after the storm hit Melbourne, the State Health Coordinator was notified by us that we had 100 plus priority patients waiting, couldn't cover them, and there was some direction of resources from us as well as from the department into the hospitals. There were some elements of the State Health Emergency Response Plan activated, but it wasn't activated in toto. And so that was at 8 o'clock, but we'd well and truly escalated, I think, almost to our fullest capacity just after 6:30. The event itself wasn't declared a public health emergency level 2 until 11 o'clock the following morning. It was well and truly over for us by then, or more or less over. Went to the media. There were a number of tweets sent out and they were retweeted. We've gone to all the mainstream media outlets, and the radio stations and the print newspapers published warnings. The actual television stations per se weren't overly interested at the time. We were on the media the following morning doing breakfast radio, both in terms of a summary of the night before as well as warnings, and there was a media conference for Tuesday morning, which was pretty hairy because I had to do it. As I said, we use social media, so we tweeted, and there's about 280,000 people reached by retweets. And then, in fact, a large amount of that retweeting was done by journalists and news organisations. There's been 3 reviews conducted now. There's an Inspector General for Emergency Management Review, and I'll talk to you about the findings. We conducted an internal review of our own. It was led by an independent chair. It's a whole-of-organisation survey, lots of face-to-face interviews. And the results of that are essentially similar to, or the findings of that and the recommendations are similar to that in the Inspector General report. What was noted that 6 out of 16 priority 0 code 1 cases that were really sick had a delay of greater than 15 minutes, which is obviously unacceptable or intolerable for patients. There was a couple of minor clinical variations that all of the cases were reviewed. There was very little in it in terms of other than very good quality care on the night. We went to all of the families who were deceased and conducted open disclosure meetings. Some declined, some accepted, and all of the families that had that ended up with who lost loved ones had psychological support provided by us, which is the first time we've done that en masse. The Inspector General's report into the 9 deaths that has gone to the coroner, as I said, we've participated in, we've contributed to the review, it's gone to the coroner, we've not heard anything back as yet, so no findings. I think the general feeling is that the coroner will find that these people, or many of these people, will have died of anaphylaxis, and it certainly looked like that on the night. So what did the Inspector General find? So basically their findings: the first documented event of this scale anywhere in the world with no formal disaster plan in place to manage it. That the concept of thunderstorm asthma is poorly understood, and whilst the Bureau can predict thunderstorms, it can't predict asthma. The pollen counts that Melbourne Uni and Deakin Uni do were useful, but their results not widely distributed and not done so in a planned way. And the rapid onset, escalation and scale of the event created an unprecedented demand in Victoria of the like which we'd not seen. The specific trigger from demand surge for ESTA, so our call takers and dispatchers, as well as us in the emergency departments, should have activated the State Health Emergency Response Plan earlier. That emergency response plans across all the agencies were not fully activated, so it didn't matter which agency you were, including the health services, those plans weren't activated. For example, the large majority of hospitals did not call an internal disaster and activate a code brown and respond, they just managed. The communications across the agencies, both internally and interagency, were not adequate. That health services, including AV, were in an invidious position where they were unable to issue public information, emergency warnings and health advice. The predictions in relation to thunderstorm asthma were likely to result in a whole lot of false alarms, so whether predicting thunderstorm asthma was going to be useful was uncertain. They deemed that warnings would be more appropriate based on certain criteria and conditions, and we've had some thunderstorm asthma warnings since, particularly immediately after. And it was felt by the Inspector General that the warnings themselves, whilst needed to be done, would probably be largely useless, given that large proportion of people who were affected had no history of asthma and would have not have been able to respond accordingly. So his recommendations, that we have a centralised online system for linking the call-taking dispatch, us and the hospitals, so that we can see each other's presentations and we know when each other has escalated. That we work with the community pharmacies in disaster preparation, because a whole lot of people wandered into pharmacies in Melbourne at the time looking for Ventolin and so on, and they were very quickly depleted of all of their stock, and so we had many people that presented who couldn't get Ventolin. That there are very clear or specific Code Brown guidelines and triggers for the health services, and that there are very defined responsibilities for people in those services around escalation and de-escalation. That there would be a thunderstorm asthma interagency working group formed between the department, the Bureau, the EPA, the unis and the health services to share the data that they've got in terms of pollen counts and so on, and use that for prediction. That there would be improved early real-time communications for developing incidents, so that activation would occur earlier, and that a steering committee would be formed across the department, us and Emergency Management Victoria to work on a single set of arrangements for health events that cause massive disaster. We're asked to lower the threshold in health for early maximum escalation, so to go earlier and go harder. It's suggested that we should have formal channels for AV to disseminate pre-hospital public information, advice and warnings in rapid onset emergencies. That role currently lay with the department. And that we develop standardised pollen and fungal monitoring protocols and news sites across Victoria, and there's been funding generated for that. And that the structures that were put in place on the night of the 21st that worked and enabled us to cope as well as we did at the time be formalised. So in summary, the Inspector General found this was an unprecedented incident, resulting obviously in a number of deaths, as I said. It was an extraordinary response, including a range of partners, that by and large it was a disaster confined to 3 hours, continued on with some elevated levels for a few days, and that the reviews have obviously provided some significant insight and areas for improvement. So an interesting yarn, but as I said, just 3 hours really that's led to all that work. So thanks very much, appreciate it.